So we, in this echo, we've had numerous talks about kind of long COVID, and I think regardless of what your experiences with the infection are and those types of symptoms, that there's a different long haul for the rest of us that is quite what we'll talk about, probably not what we expected when this started. In terms of my own disclosures, I have some research funding by national organizations and a local fund for work that I've done on COVID that's been presented here before. The program has an in-kind support from CAMH. And for the most part, what we present here is evidence-based, and where it's not, it is evidence-informed. And so in terms of learning objectives, really focusing on appreciating what the challenges that healthcare workers have faced during the pandemic, thinking about conceptualizations of mental health and mental illness that I hope might be helpful, and then thinking about ideas which I hope will lead into our further discussion about ideas that might help with your own well-being. So I have been updating the slides even as we speak this morning, because I opened my email today to have received this email, which is about observing the second anniversary of the COVID pandemic. So it was 2 years ago today that the World Health Organization and its leader, Dr. Tedros, made the announcement that we were in the midst of a global pandemic. And I think for those of us in Canada, that came after months of hearing from people around the world, reports from Italy and New York at that point about what might be coming our way. And then I think the realization that this was hitting the entire world. So our CEO, as well as the head of our board at UHN, sent an email that's quite lovely to go and reflect on what all of us have been through over the last 2 years. And I thought it was interesting that they said that for some of us, that moment might feel like it was a really long time ago. And for others, it may feel like it was just yesterday. And I don't know if many of you feel this way, but a lot of my colleagues and friends and I have spoken about how warped time feels like it has been over the last little while, about what is time and what does that feel like. And I think that has a big impact on how many of us are doing. And I've also heard from a lot of people, so anecdotal, not evidence-informed or evidence-based, that it's been a strange time the last few weeks. Like, people are feeling a real mix of emotions. And I think that, again, in Canada, we're faced with reopening, which we've talked about in recent echoes, as well as just coming out of a really difficult Omicron wave. But the other thing that often sneaks up on us is something called an anniversary reaction. And anniversary reactions are a psychological phenomenon that happen on the anniversaries of traumatic events. And so this is from the Veterans Affairs Center for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, not talking about the COVID pandemic in particular, but that other traumatic events. And what you see is that often on these types of anniversaries, people may experience an increase in distressing memories. They might come out of the blue, or might be linked to some sort of specific reminder. And that this is quite common, and it varies drastically between people, and as well, depending on what the traumatic stressor was, from feeling mildly upset to more extreme reactions where people may have significant medical or psychiatric symptoms. So this concept of a anniversary reaction can come up quite a bit, and it's something I think to be aware of. Often when people think about anniversary reactions, culturally, cultures and religions often have celebrations or memorials or traditions and activities to commemorate anniversaries. And this is part of that process. It can be felt to be something that helps us to cope, come to terms, come together during these difficult times. And I think with the COVID pandemic, one of the differences is we're still in the pandemic. So it's the anniversary of the global pandemic being called by the WHO, but also we're still in the midst of what's happening. This is a very regular slide we see in coping with COVID, but you can see actually this is from the Washington State Department of Health, right? Talking about emotional response to disasters. And like I said, prior to March of 2020, we were in this pre-disaster phase. We were hearing about warning, threat, and then the impact. Over the next year, we've talked a lot about that heroic and honeymoon phase that many of us experienced as healthcare workers, the trigger event, the disillusionment, and then you can see 12 months on what happens. And so this was came from some information from the Washington State Department of Health, where they looked at what happens after that first anniversary. And I think many of us can imagine where on this trajectory of somewhere between working through grief, reconstruction, and new beginnings, as well as secondary disillusionment, that many of us sit on, and that this diagram continues to expand. So we've been hit with wave over wave, and if you've ever been caught in a wave and you have that spiraling feeling of which way is up, where am I going, and that sense of being overwhelmed, it can be very scary. And at the same time, some people love waves. They love to surf, right? That if you can manage to pick the right wave, you can float on top of it, and something that becomes immensely powerful is something that you can enjoy and think about. And I think that's helpful. A helpful analogy or metaphor that I have, because at times when I have flow or a better state of wellness, I feel like I can manage those waves better. The general thing that you're supposed to do if you're caught in a wave when you're swimming in the ocean is just to kind of relax and not fight it, and you will float up to the surface. And I think that that's really important way to think for me, so that if I'm feeling overwhelmed and caught in that wave, to take a pause, wait to float up to the top. And that's a metaphor of wellness. I thought this was kind of cute. It was a screenshot I took about a year ago. This is anatomy of a healthcare worker from someone on a Twitter. And so talking about how much their need for coffee and exhaustion, a little bit of dark humor, contemplating career change, which links to Chantel's talk a couple of weeks ago, needing a hug, patient, and hope and humanity. And so what is wellness for each of us? I thought this was kind of an interesting idea, that each of us has a limited pie, and what fills us or fills up that pie and how we're feeling now is important to understand. And so when we think about what is wellness, there's a lot of wellness initiatives, and now there's a lot of discussion about what wellness means. And this is from the Mental Health Commission of Canada. And it talks about thinking about wellness not as a dichotomous state of well or unwell, but of existing along a continuum where you can kind of self-check in terms of how you're feeling, and looking at changes in mood, changes in thinking of attitude, behavior, performance, physical changes, and an addictive behavior. And I just really liked this way that something was viewed as a spectrum, and that as I looked through this, I could really place myself on this spectrum. And if you look at the chart within this website, which is the Mental Health Commission of Canada one, they have some strategies at each level for kind of recharging and self-care. And so when I think of myself over the last month or two, I'm probably more in that reactive stage when I look at it. I'm a little bit more irritable, a little bit more nervous. I can be distracted at times, but sleeping well, right? And so you can see on this this idea, like, where are you sitting? Which are the things that are a signal to you that you might need some help or some support. Now, the other thing that we think about a lot is the idea of mental illness and mental health, which also occurs on a spectrum. And this is a conceptualization by a sociologist called Corey Keyes. And he's a researcher that's looked at this idea that lots of people struggle without having symptoms that meet the clinical definition of having a mental health illness, like a mental illness or a mental disorder or a psychiatric disorder. And so he's done a lot of work to try and figure out, what does it mean? What does it mean if we're not feeling that we're at our mental best, but we're not mentally ill? And so he's created these 4 quadrants. And so on this y-axis, so the horizontal axis, you can see that people may have high mental illness or low mental illness. So they may have a chronic mental illness, but that doesn't mean that they can't be mentally healthy at any moment, right? So that you can flourish and have a mental illness, and that you can always also languish and have a mental illness. So he looks at mental health on this vertical axis. Conversely, you may have no mental illness and good mental health and be flourishing, but that you can also languish even in the absence of having a mental illness, so that your mental health may not be great, but you may not have a mental illness. And research over the pandemic has really suggested that this is where many of us may sit right now. So we may not have a specific mental illness, but we are not at our mental best. So if we go back to this slide, we may not be mentally healthy, but we may not be mentally ill either, somewhere in between. And he calls that state languishing. Now, this was an incredibly popular article that was published last spring around this time. I received it from many friends over email, and it's written by Adam Grant, who also does some economics and sociology work and writes several books. And he says that there's a name for the blah that you're feeling, and it's called languishing. And if we think that a large part of what's important to realizing our mental health and well-being is to be able to identify the emotions that we're feeling, that this captured a lot. And he starts this article by talking about some of the feelings that anecdotally he and his friends and colleagues had been experiencing last year. And I know that we've talked in this echo about things like depression and burnout and what those things are. But he kind of says, like, it wasn't burnout what we had. We still had energy, and it wasn't depression because we didn't feel hopeless. We just felt joyless and aimless. And that languishing is this sense of stagnation and emptiness, this feeling that you're kind of looking through a foggy window. And he said that as we got through the urgency of powering through that heroic stage, and as we got through some of the grief of loss, that it might be the dominant emotion of 2021. And so this is the emotional long haul that we speak about, and being able to name this is very, very helpful. The other thing that is really clear is that languishing is not something that is individually experienced, that it can be a collective. And I really liked this quote, that you can't heal a sick culture with personal bandages. And I know that in this echo some of the work that my colleagues, Suze Burkout and I did, where we looked at data out of the University Health Network Open Forum. So when we were allowed to ask our executive open questions that they would answer in real time, we analyzed what's the content of those questions and what is really distressing to healthcare workers at our institution during the pandemic. And there was a mix of things that people were feeling personally and individually distressed, but that was about systemic and institutional issues. And so I think this is a really important thing to talk about while we talk about individual wellness and self-care that is so individualized. It also occurs within a setting and a culture institutional and systemic issues, and we have to recognize both of those things. And when I think of stagnation and languishing, I often think of flowers blooming, right? That you bloom where you're planted. And so often, whether you are a stagnating flower or a flourishing flower depends on the quality of the soil, right? It's partly about the environment and also about what is happening with you. And so he talks about the stigmatization of mental health challenges in a world that often, I would say, but not always, normalizes physical health challenges. And that as we head into a new post-pandemic reality, which a year on, it is not post-pandemic time, that it's time that we rethink our understanding of mental health and well-being. And that not depressed doesn't mean you're not struggling, and not burned out doesn't mean you're not fired up. But by acknowledging that so many of us are languishing, we can start to give voice to a quiet despair and lighting a path out of the void. And it was really reassuring to me when I read this article and then read Corey Keyes' sociological work, that this really was based in understanding of psychology, of this sense of what is mental illness and what is mental health. So for each of us, we have to figure out about how best do we flourish. And like I said, part of that is about environment and the situation that we're in. And part of that is also about making sure that we have the nutrients that we need. And I really like this conceptualization of recharging your battery and what that means, because it applies to so many things. And this is a great, I think, metaphor or visualization to use with colleagues, with clients, with kids, because so many of us understand and take care of our phones and our laptops like they are very precious, right? When they get to like 10% and you're in single digit battery power, like you are searching for something to recharge, right? You're getting a little nervous that your device is going to deplete fully. How does that happen with us? How do we recharge our batteries? And when do we do that is a really, really critical question. And again, this metaphor holds up. We know that with certain types of rechargeable batteries, if you allow them or if they deplete fully, it actually takes more time to recharge them and they can be a little bit damaged. They don't actually get back to full power in the same way. And so there's two ways to look at this. What are the signs and symptoms or feelings that you get that suggest that your battery is being depleted? And it might help to go back to that mental health continuum that I mentioned from the Mental Health Commission of Canada that highlighted the healthy, reacting, injured, and ill, because that might help you figure out where on this spectrum you are. And then what recharges our battery for each of us is really individualized, depending on who we are and our temperament. Some of us are really invigorated by socializing. For others, that's really something that depletes us. Some people are really recharged by sitting on the couch and watching some Netflix or television. For other people, that makes them feel more depleted, and they might be wanting to be out and exercising. For some people, ordering takeout, super regenerating and renewing. For other people, that's cooking, which is exhausting to others. So how do we recognize that our emotional or a moral battery is getting low, and how do we recharge it? And sometimes when we talk about wellness, it feels like some of those concepts on recharging and what we should do in self-care can be a little bit one size fits all. And sometimes there's some evidence to suggest what's good for us, but often it's really important to know what that is individualized and then how that fits into pandemic life. I'm a super social person, but right now the idea of seeing other people potentially maskless in a few weeks is like super overwhelming to me. So how do I find that balance of having social contact that's going to be regenerative without depleting me further because I'm going to be nervous or anxious in those settings? So I think this can be a great way to really help you think about how you move forward and how we stay as charged as we can during these times as we kind of shift and transition. And so that's the end of my presentation, but I'm hoping that we can open it for discussion, thoughts about those conceptualizations, I think, of that, that spectrum of wellness, the concepts of languishing and flourishing, and then thinking about how do we recharge for ourselves and others.